Lillian Li is an author based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but who hails from our very own Washington, D.C. So welcome home. Yeah. So her debut novel, #1 Chinese Restaurant, personally hits really close to home for me as the second generation child of long-term Chinese restaurant workers in the DMV. The novel's aging Rockville eatery sets the stage to examine the complex relationships, tensions, and wounds, carved like a roast duck, between different generations of working-class Chinese-American immigrants. When disaster strikes the Beijing Duck House, Lillian Li's characters are forced to confront their many dissonant emotions with each other while their known world around them falls apart. So, I'm not going to give away too much more of the book. Here is Lillian Li.
Can you guys all hear me okay? Is this sounding good? Okay. Thank you so much for coming out today, especially since this is a Saturday evening, and I know you guys have better things to do than have me talk at you for an hour about this book. So this is just really touching to see everybody coming out. And I haven't done this for any of my other readings because I've been a little bit too nervous, but could I take a panorama of you guys? Let me see if I can do this. No. All right. So I'm going to start here. All right. Nice. I should have done that more often. I was pretty good at it. Okay, so, if you allow me, since this is my hometown reading, I have a lot more people to thank. First of all, I would just like to thank my parents, Jenny and Jason, so much for not only supporting me and coming out tonight, but also bringing just about every single person they know with them. And also thank you to my brother Chris, who definitely has better things to do today and showed up anyways. I'd also like to thank my aunt and uncle, Tracy and Bing, and my cousins, Amanda and Anita, for cutting their family vacation short in order to make this reading. I hope that this is worth missing an extra day in Spain, but probably not. I'd also like to thank my NCS classmates who came out today. In so many ways, you guys were the first people to be subjected to my writing, and so I hope it's gotten better, but you guys can be the judge of that. And speaking of being subjected to my writing, my editor, Barbara, is here as well. And she came down all the way from New York to see me read here. And, I've said this a lot, and I mean it every time, that this book could not have happened without Barbara's help, without her editorial eye. It would be just a real mess on a page. And so, thank you, Barbara. You have been as much an editor as a mentor to me. And finally, I would like to just thank Politics and Prose for having me come out and read tonight. This is actually the very first indie bookstore I ever stepped foot in. And I remember when I first walked in just being flabbergasted because I had never seen reviews by the staff before. I'd never seen a display of books that weren't bestsellers, and I didn't realize that, a bookstore could help me find the book that I was looking for. And, as you can see, I now work for an indie bookstore, Literati in Ann Arbor, so you guys have definitely left your impact on me. Okay, so I think those are all the thank yous. If I forgot to thank anybody, let me know at the end. And today I am hoping to read 2 passages to you. One is very short, and then one is longer. But before I do that, I actually wanted to speak a little bit about how I even came to write #1 Chinese Restaurant. Because I found that, even before this book came out, whenever I read interviews with writers, whenever I went to readings and there was a Q&A, I found that the #1 question that everybody likes to ask the writer is, how did you come to write this novel? When was the moment you knew this was a novel that you wanted to write? And I always found that question to be very funny, because I'm pretty certain that no writer knows the moment they wanted to write the novel. And yet all of them have an answer, and a really great answer as well. And I think that, the reason why maybe writers don't quite know is that it takes many years to write a novel and many drafts, and the novel changes every time you touch it. It's a really squirrely thing. And so I feel like just with how many years passed, there is no way to really pin down the moment that the novel kind of, erupted into the world. And I think also like the desire to have that kind of origin point makes it seem like writing and creative work in general is a really linear path, so that there's a point A and a point B, and you can travel along it, and you can get to your destination if you just follow the Google Maps. But in fact, it's a way more confusing and, like wiggly and curvy road. And so with that, there is kind of no point A. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that none of the writers are lying when they answer that question of how did I come to write this novel? Because I think that they realize, and I realize too, that behind that question of what made you want to write this novel, when was the moment you wanted to write this novel, it's actually the question of, what is the story you want to tell about your novel? What is the origin story that you want to make? And all writers are well equipped to tell that story. So actually what I want to do today is, I realized since I've been on my mini tour that every time I'm asked that question, I end up giving a different answer, and all of them are true. So because this is the hometown reading, I wanted to actually just tell you guys all of the origin stories that I have, all of them true, and all of them, I think, giving you guys a full portrait of what it was like to write this really weird novel that I wrote. So the first one is the one that I immediately go to, which is that, before I wrote a novel about an upscale Peking duck restaurant outside DC, I was a waitress at an upscale Peking duck restaurant outside DC the summer right before I went to grad school. And I find that whenever I mention that I happen to be a waitress at a Chinese restaurant, everybody's first question is, oh, well, you must have gotten that, job in order to write the novel. Actually, that wasn't a question, that was a comment. But they would usually ask, did you know if you wanted to write about that place when you, got that job? And the answer was no, because I simply wanted to make some money before grad school. I wanted to, kill the couple of months that I had left before I went to Michigan. And most importantly, I was getting over a breakup, and I didn't want to mope around my parents' house. They didn't want me to mope around their house all summer, so it was a family effort to get me this job. And, even after I started working there, I realized that I wasn't like anybody else who was working in that restaurant, because I was, first of all, 30 years younger than everybody who worked there. And actually, most of my coworkers were already in their 60s and 70s. I was the only American-born Chinese. They had all emigrated to the U.S. I was spoke English as basically a first language, while it was their second, third, sometimes fourth language. And most importantly and egregiously of all, I was the only one with zero restaurant experience. They had all, worked in restaurants for years and sometimes their entire lives. And that's all kind of foreshadowing to say that I was really, really terrible at this job. That I spilled a beer on a customer the very first night, and it just never got better from there. And, the origin story was actually the moment I quit that job. Because the moment I quit that job, I endeavored to forget it ever happened. Because I did not like this version of myself that I was seeing, right? This version who couldn't, make it longer than a month at this restaurant. Because I had always seen myself as very strong and very resilient, and I could get past every challenge that came at me. And instead, I had been reduced into this weepy mess overnight. And so I decided I just don't want to look at that version of myself. I'm going to forget I worked at this restaurant. And I figured that once I moved to Michigan and once, all of my parts stopped hurting, that it would be very easy to forget it ever happened. But it turned out that long after, my feet and my knees and my fingers stopped hurting, I was still aching. And I was aching from the memory of how lonely and how alienated I felt, working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, serving people who looked right past me, who essentially saw me as a piece of furniture in this restaurant, as I saw all of my coworkers. And I thought, how could anybody possibly work in that kind of environment for longer than a month? But the thing was that everybody besides me had. And they were not crying every night to their mother. They were laughing, they were joking, they were singing. They also were complaining. And I basically just started to wonder, what it would take for a person to be able to not only survive in that kind of environment, but to, thrive in it. What kind of, but also what that environment would end up doing to a person over the years, what they would try to do in order to find connection and respect and love inside the restaurant, and what they might give up in the outside world in order to have that. And so that is one origin story, that through that kind of compulsive imagining, through that inability to forget the time I quit a bad summer job, this novel came about. But there's another origin story, which is that actually while I was still working at that restaurant, I did something wrong. I don't remember what, but my boss pulled me aside and he just started ripping me a new one. And I really don't know what I did to deserve it. He probably does. And I was just so shocked. I'd never been yelled at like that before, besides my parents. And I, in that shock, looked right into his eyes. And then I became even more shocked. Because usually when someone is angry, you can see in their eyes that they're, feeling uncomfortable and they're kind of out of control and they don't really like what they're feeling in that moment. And you can see that all in their eyes. But when I looked into my boss's eyes in that moment of severe anger, I saw total calm. And in fact, you could even say that he had a twinkle in his eye. He looked like he was kind of having fun. He looked like this was actually a pretty enjoyable experience. And I just started to wonder, what about maybe owning a Chinese restaurant, right? Putting all of your hard work and ambition into this space that in America just does not get as much respect as owning an Italian or a French restaurant. What might that do to a person over the years? And, why might anger become a kind of sanctuary for somebody? So that's another origin story. Third one. So this one actually came months later when I was talking to my mother and I was home and she said, "Do you remember that really hilarious thing you did one night after work?" And I said, No, please tell me. And I still have no memory of this, but it sounds like me, so I do believe her. But apparently one night, so my mom worked in restaurants for about 5 years after she came to America. And so she was a real comfort and an ally when I was trying to get through those 4 weeks at my restaurant. And every night we had a ritual where she would come and talk to me in my bedroom, and I would tell her everything that had happened that day, who was awful to me, who was nice, and that was how we spent every night. But that particular night, I apparently was just so distraught that I did not want to talk to her. I said, "Leave me alone, please leave me alone." And she had never seen me so upset before, so she followed me to my room, and she kept asking questions. And after just a little while, I completely broke down and just started weeping, crying about just how awful the job was, how awful everything was, how much everything hurt. And apparently, while I was crying, while tears were streaming down my face, I reached into my back pocket and I took out my tips and I started counting the money while I was crying. And apparently it just was the funniest thing my mom has ever seen. And I really don't remember it, but after she told me that happened, again, that started me thinking, right? That moment when I was so emotionally wrecked, for me to still be capable of counting the amount of money I'd made that day that had so emotionally wrecked me, that kind of cycle of, pain and then reward, pain and reward, and how that's linked into Chinese restaurant life, that was yet another thing. And so all of this is building into my fourth origin story, which is the last one, I promise, today. There might be more later, but this origin story actually made it into the book. So I was basically setting up for this little passage. And this one came earliest of all, because when I was growing up, I was obsessed with Aesop's fables. I just loved the lessons that were inside it. I loved the animals, and I just devoured any, book that had a fable in it. And one fable apparently stuck with me, because when I was thinking about whether or not I wanted to write a book about a Chinese restaurant, this fable jumped out at me, and it basically pushed me, I think, into a lot of the ideas that I try to explore in this book. So I'm going to actually go ahead and read that fable to you, and it comes out of the mouth of Feng Fei Han. So Feng Fei is the matriarch of the Han family, and the Han family is the family that owns the Beijing Duck House, which is where everybody works and where this book is set. And what we know about Feng Fei is that after her husband Bobby dies, she pretty much retreats into their mansion and is just never really seen. But she reappears in a very interesting way later in this book. And in this passage, she talks about this fable that she repeatedly told her sons, Johnny and Jimmy, when they were growing up, as a way for them to learn about the world and learn about themselves. And of course, because they're her sons, they do not listen. But she again tells us this story. Let's see. Feng Fei was most disgusted when faced with a person who did not understand his own limitations. When she saw such behavior in her sons, she could have wept from disappointment. She had tried to teach them the only way she knew how with an old fable she'd read in a translated book. She'd repeated the story so many times. One day, she always began, a donkey wandered out of its stable, attracted to the sound of its owner laughing. At this, Johnny always started laughing as well, and Feng Fei would shout at him to stop acting like an idiot. The donkey saw that his owner was making a monkey dance on the roof of his house. Feng Fei would make the fingers of her right hand flutter on her sons' noses. So the donkey climbed onto the roof with the monkey and started dancing too. Feng Fei's left hand would follow her right. But the donkey was too heavy for the roof. Its hooves broke through the plaster, making a large hole. The owner pulled the donkey outside and beat it until it cried, "But why did you laugh at the monkey, but not at me?" She always paused here, waiting for her sons to chorus the moral of the fable back, but they would already be distracted. She would have to slap their hands to get them to listen. "Because you are a donkey, and it is a monkey," the owner said, bringing the stick down on the poor, dumb donkey's hide. "Which ones are we?" Johnny would ask, desperate to be part of the winning team. "I'm a monkey, right, Ma? And Jimmy's a donkey." "I'm not," Jimmy would protest. "That's not the point," she'd say. "The point is that what some can do, you cannot. What you can do, others cannot. Get it?" So that's my favorite fable. And I think that some people find it very dark. And it is. It's like the dark side of be yourself, which is like you cannot be anything but yourself. And I think so much of what the characters struggle with in this book is sort of this understanding of who am I not, and how can I be what I am when all I want is to be what I'm not. So those are all the origin stories I have today. So just to check in, is everybody okay with me continuing in this vein? I know writers always check, and it's not like we're going to listen either way, but it's still nice to have this permission. So I'm going to now read from a longer passage, and the reason I want to read from this chapter is in part to honor Barbara, my editor, because this chapter I'm going to read from would not exist without her. It was the kind of last chapter I ever wrote for this book. I wrote it after I'd already sold it, after we'd already been working together for a couple of months, and one day we're having a conversation on the phone and she says, "I think, we really need to see Jimmy as a younger man." So Jimmy Han is basically the youngest brother of the Han family, and he's the current owner of the Beijing Duck House. And in the current day, he is 40, he is angry, he is bitter, and he is basically just a total asshole. And I love him. I think that is the best part about him. And I wanted readers to love that about him as well. But Barbara said, you should really, we should see him when he's younger. We should see him when he still has dreams and hopes and ambitions and stars in his eyes. And we need to see what happened to him that made him who he is today. And I said, "Barbara, you are destroying my artistic vision. How dare you?" But, luckily she is more persistent than I am. And I finally wrote this chapter just to get her off my back. And I thought it would be such a pain. And instead it was the fastest chapter I ever wrote. And after I wrote it, we barely changed it. It's pretty much, what I wrote is what made it in. And so It's become kind of my favorite chapter. It's become a lot of people's favorite chapters. I'm glad I trusted Barbara all along. And I'm going to go ahead and read from that today in honor of her. So all you have to know is that Jimmy is 19 years old in this chapter. He has been waiting tables at the Beijing Duck House, his father's restaurant, and he has just quit in order to stage at an Asian fusion restaurant in DC named Koi. So a stage, for those of you who don't know, is basically an unpaid internship in cooking. Turns out there are unpaid internships in every field. And so that's pretty much all you have to know. The first 2 decades of Jimmy's life, he believed cooks didn't talk in the kitchen. Waiters could shout, dishwashers could flirt with the duck carvers, but the cooks stood silent over their woks. They were like the old horses Jimmy had once seen on a duck farm in Long Island, with their sloped backs and long, motionless faces. They looked too miserable for words. He was a few months shy of 20 when he walked into Koi's pristine lobby on the first day of his stage. He passed the indoor waterfall and rock garden, through the restaurant's sunlit dining room. He assumed he was about to enter an equally soundless kitchen. The chef, a white man named Alfred, led the way. I don't usually let people stage who haven't worked in a kitchen before. The chef glanced down at the overpacked knife kit in Jimmy's hands. How many resumes did you fax me again? A lot, Jimmy said. Chef, he added, 60 resumes, and not a single one with relevant work experience. Chef Alfred knocked back a double shot of espresso. But you have passion. That's something you can't teach. He thought for a moment. You can use a knife, though, yes? Jimmy nodded. He'd been practicing on crates of onions filched from the duck house, and he'd gone through so many that the amount of missing produce was driving his father crazy. Jimmy's father had no idea who to blame, and when he wasn't on the phone with the produce supplier, he was interrogating every person on staff, from the prep cooks to the little girl who poured water on the weekends. Served him right, asshole. If Bobby hadn't thrown him out of the duck house for wanting to apprentice at Koi, Jimmy could have afforded to buy his own practice onions. The tips he'd saved had run out with his rent check, and stages didn't pay. He felt too young for the knives he was holding. He was 19 and had never been broke in his life. Knife skills we can teach, the chef was saying, but we'd rather not. Thank you for this opportunity, Jimmy said. They approached the kitchen doors and excitement replaced his dread. 2 months ago, after his mother insisted they go for her birthday, he'd eaten at Koi for the first time. His world had split open as neatly as an apricot. His father had not enjoyed the meal. Chef Alfred put his hand on the kitchen door and pushed his way in. You're free labor, he said, before the sound of pans crashing together swallowed his words. The noise was sudden and explosive. Jimmy didn't realize most of it was coming from a stereo in the back. Shut that fucking death metal off, Ronnie, Chef Alfred yelled, his pale face growing pink as he battled the volume of the music, or I'll fucking gut you. The kitchen was full of stout men with sleeve tattoos and wild, unfocused looks in their eyes, but to Jimmy's surprise, Ronnie turned out to look not unlike himself. Strolling to the stereo, Ronnie turned the volume dial a scooch to the left, looking at the chef with what Jimmy's father would have called a smack-me face. Hurry it up. Chef Alfred was tasting the stock. He rapped the spoon against the edge of the pot. Ronnie held up a long finger and continued his slow turning. Just trying to find the perfect compromise, chef. He wrinkled his nose to push up his John Lennon glasses. Not too quiet, not too loud, just right. I'll shove that tape up your ass, how's that for a compromise? I can't work without my music, Ronnie said, his voice a playful whine, but he turned the volume dial from 10 to 6. The caterwauling of the Norwegian vocalist died to a medium yowl. He sounded as if he were coughing up phlegm now rather than blood. That's our fish cook, Ronnie, Chef Alfred said. I don't know why I haven't cut him yet, but you'll be helping out at his station. Chef, I got that eel. Ronnie came up to them then, with a plated tureen of unagi over toasted rice. The smell of mirin, sake, and sesame oil, the holy trinity of fragrance, hit Jimmy's nose. His stomach grumbled, loud enough for both men to hear. He'd been living off onion sandwiches for a week. Little dude's hungry, Ronnie clapped Jimmy on the shoulder. Chef Alfred carved a spoon through the tower and chewed. He began to hum softly. A dreamy look settled over his face, and he leaned against a steel prep table. That's it. He sucked the sauce off his teeth. That's why you're still here. Butchered it myself, Ronnie said. Then he turned to Jimmy. Want a taste? Jimmy grabbed the chef's spoon and shoved half the terrine into his mouth before he realized his mistake. The two men looked at him with shocked faces. Shit, that was for the rest of the kitchen, Ronnie said, looking at the plate. We taste in the kitchen, we don't eat, Chef Alfred said. Jimmy knew he should be embarrassed, but the eel was buttery and sweet in his mouth, flaking against his tongue like snow, and the toasted rice cut through the softness with a nutty crunch. His stomach filled with warmth. He reached out for the plate again before Ronnie could pull it away and plucked a crisp half-moon of cucumber to clear the unagi sauce off his tongue. That was amazing, he said, picking a sesame seed out of his teeth. Like one of the best things I've eaten in my entire life. Can you teach me how to make it? Where the fuck did you find this kid? Ronnie asked. He just hoovered my dish. Reminds me of you, a passing cook said, stockpot in his arms. Yo, that's racist, Ronnie called over his shoulder. Then he pushed the plate into Jimmy's hands. What's your name? Jim, gonna call you Hoover. With that, Ronnie brought Jimmy around the kitchen and introduced him to the other cooks and kitchen staff. Jimmy quickly learned that Ronnie was the unofficial ambassador of the Koi crew, untethered by kitchen hierarchy. He not only knew everybody, prep cooks, line cooks, and pastry chefs alike, but had recently partied with, schemed with, or owed money to each person who shook Jimmy's hand. He reminded Jimmy of a cruder, cooler version of his own brother. This racist is key. Ronnie grabbed the white cook with the stock pot by the back of his neck. He's the saucier. Don't ever let this man drive your car. And over here, he fist-bumped a Hawaiian man with 3 skull rings on his hand. That's Louis the grill man. You ever need a fake license, you call him. You still do passports, Lou? Ronnie finished the tour with the dishwashers, a trio of Hondurans who looked at the empty plate in Jimmy's hands with open disgust. They usually get a taste after the rest of the kitchen, Ronnie whispered, bringing Jimmy back to his station. Look, we'll get you back into everyone's good graces. He reached under his prep table and pulled out a big blue bucket. Something was thunking against the plastic. Jimmy looked down to see a swirl of freshwater eels, their gray and white bodies thick and tangled in the low water. You ever butcher an eel before? Ronnie put on a blood-spotted fillet glove. He stuck his hand in the bucket and pulled out a wriggling eel by the head, its thin, muscular body almost the length of Jimmy's arm. I made this contraption myself. He pointed to the wet board on his table, a screwdriver sticking out of the wood. How do you butcher an eel? Jimmy asked. A strange floating sensation clouded his head. He realized his hands were sweating. Easy, Ronnie said. In one fluid motion, he slammed the eel onto the board and stuck the screwdriver through its head. He hammered the driver down with the flat of his knife, then stuck the blade below the gills, running it down the length of the eel until he'd butterflied it in half. Jimmy started breathing hard through his nose, black spots dancing in his vision. Ronnie spread the eel open like a book, and as he was dragging the knife back down, peeling the translucent white flesh off the skin, Jimmy felt his eyes roll up in his head. With a strangled curse, he went down hard. He came to when he felt someone's clog push against his ribs. He rolled up into a seated position, clinging to the leg of the prep table while the blood rushed into his head. Blinking up at Ronnie, he felt like crawling out of the kitchen and into the busy street. You shit yourself? Ronnie asked, as if Jimmy were a toddler he didn't particularly like. He scratched his nose with the side of his glove. Look, why don't you go gut those tomatoes? His knife pointed to the stack of crates by the walk-in fridge. Can you handle that? Jimmy nodded, his face still clammy. He stood up on his own, Ronnie having already turned back to his butcher board. He finished off 4 eels while Jimmy was passed out. The fillets were curled up like sausage casings, piled next to a stack of emptied skins. Jimmy slapped his cheeks and moved toward the tomatoes. The tomatoes aren't bleeding, Ronnie shouted after him. It's just juice. He turned to the other cooks, cackling. When's the last time any of you passed out like that? The cooks traded stories, the noise in the kitchen growing again. Jimmy sliced tomato after tomato. He was so mad at himself that he squeezed a few to bursting, and he hid those beneath the seeded guts he'd scraped from the others. With Chef Alfred no longer in the kitchen, Ronnie turned his music back up, head-banging while he ripped his way through the rest of the eels. The flaps of his bandana flew, wild. His glasses grew splattered with water and blood. Jimmy watched him from the corner of his eye, fighting the queasiness in his stomach. So this was what a real cook looked like, sounded like, moved like. If the cooks at the Duck House were workhorses, then Ronnie and the rest of his kitchen were demon dogs, wrestling their prey and each other to the ground. Dogs with finesse hidden even in their most violent, butchering acts. Dogs who could fucking cook. Jimmy wondered where he might go to get his hands on some live eels. Thank you. Okay. So I think now is time for questions, but before I get to that, I just forgot to mention that I am doing a book club special. So if your book club picks #1 Chinese restaurant, I will Skype in and chat with everybody and be a general delight. And so I have bookmarks with more information up here. And also, I know it's hard to ask questions in this space, so if you ask a question, I will give you a promotional chopstick. So just let that guide your questions. Okay, so who would like to come up to the mic?
So I've read the book and I loved it. And the characters are so richly drawn. I'm curious how much of that is developed before you really get into writing the book, and how much of that character development happens as you're editing and adding more layers.
That's a really great question. Are you Jennifer?
I am.
Hi, we're internet friends. So the thing is that when I started writing, I wrote fan fiction. So for those who don't know, fan fiction is when you take something from another medium, so like Harry Potter in my case, and then you just write stories about the characters doing whatever you want them to do. Which means that for me, writing has always been character driven. So to answer your question, I didn't really start this book or felt like it was a book until I felt like I had my characters. And I think because also I'm so interested in family, both, blood family and work family and everything in between, I wanted to basically come up with the characters at the same time that I came up with their relationships to each other. So that meant that when I came up with Jimmy and his brother Johnny, they came at the same time because I knew that I wanted to look at sibling rivalry in the restaurant. And when I came up with Nan and Jack, who are two longtime waiters, I knew that they would have to come in together because I wanted to explore what a long-term, 3-decade-long friendship might look like in a Chinese restaurant. So essentially what was really lucky for me was that as soon as I started writing, I knew that the characters were alive to me and they were alive to each other, which meant that I couldn't abandon the book because it would mean basically abandoning real people to me. So that was pretty much how I came up with it. Would you like your chopsticks?
Okay.
Oh, of course.
So, yeah. What's your favorite Chinese food dish?
Dish? Okay. Yeah. So my favorite Chinese food dish is 五根肠旺. Some recognition. So I think it is, it's mixed up whether it's Taiwanese in origin or Sichuanese, but it's essentially braised intestine with pork or duck blood in a scallion stew, and it comes out bubbling in a kind of cauldron-like contraption, and it is super tasty. There is a restaurant in Rockville called the China Canteen that serves it, and I haven't really been able to find it elsewhere. So I recommend it to anyone here who would like to try it.
That's a great recommendation. I also recommend Sichuan River.
Oh, very cool. Do you want chopsticks, Jade?
I already got some.
You already got some?
So,
okay.
yeah.
All right.
Hi. I'm wondering if you are an outliner or a pantser.
Like fly by the seat of my pantser. Definitely a pantser. I think that I'm on a lazier side, and I also don't like necessarily following a routine after a certain time. So I feel like outlining always makes me feel like I already know what's going to happen, so why would I write it? I kind of like the idea of having characters in the book basically, show me the way, if that makes sense. And I think that so far it's worked for me. And I think until it does, I don't have to do an outline. But there might come a point where that's necessary. And in terms of just like binaries that split writers apart, there's another binary I want to talk to you guys about, which is the vomiter versus the bleeder. I know it's disgusting. Writers are very dramatic people, but it basically means that if you're a bleeder, then, you know, when you write, it's like drawing blood out of you. Like every word is just like a drop of blood, and it's so painful. But what's great about the bleeders is that once they have a paragraph written, that paragraph is perfect. Like they're not changing it. It might have taken them a year, but it is perfect. And then you can imagine a vomiter is just somebody who like, all over the page. And they require a lot of editing. And if you ask my editor, I'm definitely a vomiter. So that's another binary that I like to operate by. Do you want your chopstick?
Hey.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your process for writing. Like, do you write full time currently, or how did you get into it? Did you do grad school for it?
Yeah, that was a great question. So I did go and get my MFA in fiction, which is kind of like, I guess, the grad school version of writing, except that it's mostly just there to give you time, which freaks out a lot of people, including myself, to finally get the time that we've been complaining that we need. And then we get it, and we realize that it's still a problem to write at all. Now we have nobody to blame but ourselves. And so I basically had to figure out my routine when I was given essentially 3 years to write as much as I wanted to. And what I found is, like I said, I get very bored of routine after a while, and yet routine is what makes writing happen. If you don't, sit down and do the grind, it just won't get written. So how do I basically figure out how to trick myself into a routine? So I think that like what my process ends up being is just like however I can make it seem like fun and novel to myself is often the easiest way for me to start writing. So sometimes that means like having a writing contract with a friend where we basically shame each other every single day to be like, have you written 1,000 words yet? No. Have you? No. And that will go for maybe a week until one of us drops out. So I've done that 3 times with 3 different people. And I've also recently, I decided to like take out this typewriter that I had that was gifted to me maybe 5 years ago, and it was totally covered in dust. It had not been used in that long. And I just decided to type out the paragraphs that I was writing, right, to really get into like the beat and the rhythm of creating the words. And then after 3 days, I got a headache from all the banging, and I put that away. And then most recently, I actually took out one of my favorite books. It was the Jane Austen book club, FYI, if anybody wants to read that. And I just basically copied it almost word for word, all the moves I was making, and just subbed out the characters' names. And I did that for about a week until I got incredibly bored of that. So I think my process is just tricking myself into not being bored until I get bored of that trick, and then I go back to the routine.
I have a question. Do you see this as your signature style, or do you think you might branch off into other themes for other books?
So like writing about family and yeah.
Well, as opposed to detective stories or horror stories. I mean, what? How do you see your style of writing developing in subsequent books?
That's a great question, because I have been kind of like fooling around this idea of on the side writing a detective novel about my dad, because he does the sort of maintenance of some apartments as a fun side gig. He just likes talking to the people, and I just thought, how funny would it be if he came upon a dead body one day, and what might he do? So that might be in the works for sure. But I think that it's also a great question of like, will I keep writing about families? Will I keep writing about multi-generational Chinese American communities? And I think that definitely there will always be an interest in that. And I don't know what that interest might take. But I think I remember feeling a kind of anxiety or maybe an insecurity about wanting to write the same kind of book, because I already wrote a book about it. So why would I want to kind of go back into that space again? But then I think I was reading this interview with this amazing Vietnamese poet, Ocean Vuong, and he essentially said, that he had also felt that same kind of insecurity, having written his amazing book, Night Sky with Bullet Wounds. Was he still going to write about that experience? And then he kind of realized that it takes more than a book. It might take an entire lifetime of books to explore something as big as the subject of, that experience. And in fact, by saying that only one book is allowed for that experience, it's actually reducing it and making it feel like something you could possibly understand within like these 3 years of your life. So I feel like, you know, as I keep living and growing, I'm going to have so many other ideas about that theme. And so I feel like every book that I write, even if it's just like the same Chinese restaurant book over and over again, I think it will still be very different from itself.
This is a little bit related. I wondered if you had any particular fictional models. And you mentioned the Jane Austen book club. What was the last book you read that you loved?
Great questions. So I think that to answer the first question, right, models or influences I always find that to be a very hard question to answer because I feel like other people tend to tell me who I'm copying. And so I actually would love to hear whenever anyone has read it, if they will let me know who it reminds them of, because I don't think I know. But I've actually, you know, I've been thinking about that question a lot, just in general, and I realized that what instead I can answer more easily is what worldviews, so what authors' worldviews are actually in tune with mine. And so what I mean by that is I think that every book basically is a window into this author's perspective on the world, how they see it, how they understand it, how they think you should move through it. And that means, you know, I feel like sometimes when you don't agree with an author or don't enjoy their book, it's sometimes because your worldviews don't match and they don't talk to each other. And so for me, one of the, I think, worldviews that I share is definitely Karen Joy Fowler, who wrote the Jane Austen book club. And I think her worldview is basically the world is a very dark place. So we're going to need some humor, right, to get through it. But at the same time, this humor is not meant to rescue you from the world, because I think she understands in her writing that, you know, humor is a nice way to comfort yourself from the darkness, but it's also a way to accidentally resign yourself to it. That if you become comfortable with how dark it is, you will never want to change it. So I think that, you know, the Jane Austen book club, but especially her latest, We Were Completely Beside Ourselves, I think those two books definitely attempt to portray that worldview. And one other would be probably Ruth Ozeki, whose most recent book is Tale for the Time Being. And her specifically, I think it's just that fiction is magic. And it doesn't have to be like reality. And in fact, it can save you from your reality. And I think so I'm trying to work with kind of both humor and magic and darkness at all times. And favorite book most recently is probably My Education by Susan Choi. It's a fantastic book. I think it came out a couple of years ago, but it's basically this sort of young grad student in Regina ends up thinking that she's going to be falling for her very charismatic professor, but instead ends up falling for his more charismatic wife. And it's sort of an interesting look at, you know, what it means to kind of be a young person and then make those young mistakes and then have to live with those mistakes. Yeah.
I have to follow up on the Harry Potter reference. Is fan fiction available anywhere online under your name? And anything particularly interesting that you did?
It is under my avatar or username, which I will not share. But if you sign up for my author newsletter, you will have access to that, because I most recently sent out an excerpt of my fan fiction. I will give you the title of that fanfic that I sent out. You could possibly search that. It's called The Hormonal Ups and Downs of Misao Makimachi. It's a Rurouni Kenshin fanfic. I wrote that from middle school through high school, and it is about the length of a novella. So that exists in the world for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I haven't read your book yet, but so I don't know how much dialogue's in there, but could you talk a little bit about the process and the craft of dialogue? Because I think it's so important in a novel or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great question, because it's definitely something I thought about a lot, especially since, you know, my characters are bilingual and they occupy a space where they're constantly switching language, and not even just switching language, but depending on who they are talking to, right, their boss or their son, that language shifts even more depending on the context. And I think I struggled with the dialogue at first because I wondered if it should be, you know, like reality. So, you know, to basically sound like how it would sound if we were to walk into a Chinese restaurant and hear the waiters talking in English and in Chinese. But then I realized that that was not something that I had to do, that wasn't any promise that fiction had made, that in fact what fiction can do is basically just create the illusion or the effect of what that experience might be like. And since essentially I was writing for myself, as like a lot of first novels I think are for just the author, because we don't know if it'll ever be published, I was trying to understand how I experience language as a bilingual person. And I've realized that, it's not so much that when, for example, my parents are speaking to me in English versus Chinese, I'm not thinking like, oh, they're speaking English or, oh, they're speaking Chinese. I'm actually thinking like, what I'm clocking is actually the amount of effort that is being spent on communicating. And so, obviously that when Chinese is spoken, there is no effort. It is light. It is like effervescent, and there is that kind of sense of like quickness and flight. And when English is spoken, there is a little bit more effort, and that's mostly what I'm clocking. And similarly, when I speak Chinese, the effort is enormous, and I think that was something that I wanted to portray and play with when I wrote dialogue, was rather than just trying to cast it verbatim, that it should in fact just have an inflection of effort, and that would be enough for the reader to understand whether or not the person is speaking Chinese or English or whatever their native language is.
So I have a question about, if we have that saying, write what we know, but I myself, when I'm writing, I feel like I don't even have like authority over my experiences as a woman of color, as a queer person, like all these different things, I don't know if you identify with that, and if you do, what was your journey like? And then moving beyond writing what we know, if we don't even feel confident writing what we know, how do we write what we don't know?
Excellent question. That's so good. So I think that I've taught only a couple of creative writing courses at the university where I work, but I've loved all of them because I basically teach introductory students, so it's the first time ever writing their story, whatever that story might be. And I think that what I have started to try and push them to do is actually thinking about writing not as basically what you do when you have all the answers. That in fact, the best writing, the writing that feels the most alive on the page, to me, no matter how messy it is when it's clear that the writer is trying to think through something, that they are trying to know something, and that the fact of not knowing, that fact of questioning, is what is sort of forcing them to put their words on the page. And so I think actually, instead of writing what we know, maybe what is a little closer is trying to write what we would really want to know, what we would really need to know. And that would force us to then, answer that question of why we need to know that. And I think that in general, for me, what maybe shifted my confidence in being able to write stories that felt a little bit outside my depth is I think about writing as my way of becoming a better person, or maybe what's more honest is to make me be a more active and observant person in the world, and to be more cognizant of the worlds that I occupy and what is going on around me. So every time I write, it is that attempt to understand rather than to repeat what I already understand. So I hope that's helpful for you.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really beautiful.
Oh, we can talk more.
Hi, thank you for your book. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, good.
We're in Politics and Prose. There have been a number of people who have worked at this bookstore that have gone on to write their own books. Like you work at an indie bookstore, you're repping it right now. I'm wondering how your experience being around books, potentially working with other authors, influenced you as a reader and ultimately as a writer.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I definitely count myself so lucky to have worked at Literati. So basically, I got hired at Literati just a couple months before I went into that process of putting my book into editors' hands. And I still work there, and they celebrated my launch. And so essentially, Literati has been in my life as long as I have been trying to publish this book. And I think that it was incredibly important that I have this job, because it basically pushed me out of this bubble, this kind of isolating bubble where I was mostly just hanging out with other MFA students, right, other writers, and thinking what they thought about books and thinking that they were the only kind of readers out there. And unfortunately, I will say that writers are sometimes not the best readers, because we don't always read in good faith. We tend to read thinking that there's going to be issues, because since we're writers, we make a ton of mistakes in our writing, so we assume the same of all other writers. And that's not the best space to be in when you're thinking about having a book coming out into the world, because you're just thinking like, they're going to notice every single thing I did wrong, all the things that I know I did wrong, and they're going to make fun of me behind my back. And it was working at Literati and being constantly, around other readers, because what's great about indie bookstores is that I'm always talking to the people who come in, because I'm giving them recommendations. We're talking about what they used to love to read. And in that process, I only saw enthusiasm, and I only saw reading in good faith. And I also saw how widely tastes went, so that, in fact, there wasn't good or bad taste, just their taste. And they always had good reason for why their taste didn't swing one way or the other, and it was never really the book's fault. It was just simply their own, what they like personally. So I think that if I hadn't had that experience sort of keeping me sane the entire time, I think publishing a book would have been much scarier. And I think now, as I'm kind of approaching writing that next book, it is just so helpful to have a constant reminder that there are all these kinds of readers out there, and I will find the audience, or the book will find the audience eventually, and that I don't have to stress out as much as I have been.
Hi, I have two questions. They're pretty contrasting. So the first one is, and you're looking back on your choice to address perspectives that, as you said, are of people who often fade into the background, are not as prominent in day-to-day life. Was there anything you wanted to show about the lives of these people in your book? And then the second question is, so a title is the first thing people see about your book, and it's what your entire work is associated with. So as a person who has trouble writing titles for my Yelp reviews, I would like to know, what was it like to find a phrase that could capture your entire book?
Those are such great questions. That's also my cousin Amanda. I didn't know you wrote Yelp reviews. I'll have to look those up. So the first question, I think that was definitely a question that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, what do I want people to take away from this book? And I think at first, the easiest answer is, I want them to learn something about the people who work at Chinese restaurants. And then I realized that I don't want that at all. What I'd actually rather have is whoever reads that book to learn something about themselves. And if that is learning about why it is that they think of Chinese waiters as furniture in a Chinese restaurant, that is actually what I want to be happening, for those thoughts to be arising. So in fact, there is nothing to really educate or teach a person about the Chinese waiters at a Chinese restaurant. There's only education about, or discussion or thought about, what those kind of preconceived ideas were and why they happen and what you're going to do about them now. So to answer your second question, why is this called #1 Chinese Restaurant? I think that, one of the other reasons that I wanted to write a book set in a Chinese restaurant is that I have been thinking a lot about how to write Chinese American characters without spotlighting their race. Making the racial part of the identity the only part about them, the only way that they see the world and move through the world, and other people responding to them. Because that's not how I experience my identity. That's just one piece of the general identity pie. And so I realized that, a Chinese restaurant is one of the only places where if I don't name a character, you won't name a character's race, you won't automatically assume that they are a white character. Because that's what ends up happening, is that the default character is white. But in a Chinese restaurant, that's absolutely not the case. The default gets to be Chinese. And so the book is sort of one more push in that direction to sort of set and prime the reader up for this is a Chinese restaurant, this is a Chinese book. And because the phrase never shows up again, it's simply there to kind of set this idea that this is going to be a book with Chinese characters. And also, once again, to kind of tie back into my answer for your first question, people have had such interesting reactions to this book where they feel is this offensive? Is this supposed to be funny? Who is the joke on? And in so many ways, this is a really simple phrase. And this would not be a reaction that would happen if it was #1 French restaurant or #1 Italian restaurant. So once again, even the person's initial reaction to the book and why they might think that #1 Chinese Restaurant is an offensive or funny title is just, again, something that I kind of want people to have in mind when they're going through. Do you want 2 chopsticks because you asked 2 questions?
So in a lot of ways, this is a celebration of your book launch and it being your first book as well. But I know launch doesn't always necessarily mean done. To artists, a lot of the time, there's always places they wish they could dive deeper and explore. Is there anywhere in here that you wish that you'd explored a little bit more, or a missed opportunity?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because it's what I've been fretting about ever since this book came out, was what I wish I had done differently. But I think that, you know, because this book only happens within this time span of about a month, you know, this book couldn't really delve as deeply into the characters' pasts, and it was very focused much more on kind of what is presently happening when they no longer have this Chinese restaurant in their lives, but not what their lives were like before they came into this kind of monolithic structure that's been shaping them. And so, you know, there are kind of hints and pieces of, you know, what their lives were like before they entered the Chinese restaurant, you know, how they came to America sometimes is talked about with certain characters. But I wish that I had had a chance to, even if not to put in the book, just to explore more and to have done more research understanding how Chinese immigrants end up working in Chinese restaurants, what the sort of paths are, because they're not as actually straightforward as I used to think. And I think as I've been talking to more people, I've realized that there are so many paths to working at a Chinese restaurant. You know, sometimes there are people who were students at the university and then dropped out because that university work was too boring and hard, and instead they'd rather have that quick money of a Chinese restaurant. And so it's not necessarily just one, you know, size fits all when it comes to a narrative of how someone ends up working in a Chinese restaurant. And I wish I had done a little bit more to kind of bring that to the book. And so maybe the next Chinese restaurant book I write is going to be all about the prequel. But thank you for that question. And thank you everybody so much for coming out today.